They told the world I had lost my mind, but the only thing I ever lost was my faith in the man I married. Long before the whispers spread through London, before doctors signed papers and doors were locked behind me, the truth had already been decided in my husband's heart. On the day I would later walk into an auction hall and buy back my ancestral home with £10 million of my own hidden fortune, I would prove to every voice that dared to doubt me that Cordelia Ashworth had never been broken. I remember the morning they came for me as clearly as if it were painted on the walls of my memory. Autumn light poured through the tall windows of Thornhaven Manor, soft and golden, warming the oriental carpet my grandmother had brought home from her travels. I was seated at my writing desk, finishing a letter to my solicitor, yet when the door opened without a knock, Reginald stood there, my husband, flanked by two men I had never seen before. Their expressions were cold and professional. Behind them hovered Dr. Bartholomew Pembridge, a physician known in polite society for treating ladies of nervous disposition. His name was spoken quietly in drawing rooms, always followed by lowered voices and uneasy glances. Reginald's face wore the careful look of concern he showed the world, but I had been married to him long enough to see what hid beneath it. There was satisfaction in his eyes. We had argued the night before. I had found documents in his study, papers proving he intended to sell the eastern fields of Thornhaven. That land had belonged to my mother's family for 6 generations. It was not his to sell, except through me. When I confronted him, he laughed. What he called me hysterical. He told me a wife had no right to question her husband's decisions. Then he warned me that if I continued to make trouble, he would be forced to protect me from myself. I did not understand his meaning until Dr. Pembridge stepped forward that morning holding a syringe. I remember Reginald leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching as the doctor approached me. I tried to speak. I tried to protest. But the needle pierced my skin and the world grew heavy. They carried me from my own home like a burden to be removed. The carriage curtains were drawn, and I was too drugged to scream. I could only watch the countryside slide past through a narrow gap in the fabric. The trees along the road looked like mourners, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky. I wondered if anyone would speak for me, and I wondered if anyone would even notice I was gone. Briarcliff Asylum rose from a wind-swept hill in Yorkshire like a grim monument. Pale stone walls, tall windows, and an air of cold order surrounded the place. When they helped me down from the carriage, my legs barely held me. Faces appeared behind the windows. Women in white gowns watched with quiet curiosity as I was led inside. The halls were clean and polished, but they felt lifeless. The air smelled of soap and medicine. Nurses moved quickly, their faces blank with routine. Dr. Aldous Whitfield, the director, received me in his office. He spoke gently, slowly, as if I were already a child. My husband, he said, had explained everything. My hysteria, my delusions, my violent behavior. The story grew worse with every sentence. I listened in disbelief as he described incidents that had never happened. When I tried to speak, to explain the truth, Dr. Whitfield only nodded and wrote in his journal. He said denial was common. Acceptance, he told me, was the first step toward recovery. They placed me in a small room on the 2nd floor. The bed was narrow. The window did not open. The door locked from the outside. Dr. Whitfield assured me it was for my own safety. When I asked when I could go home, he smiled and said it would depend on my improvement. I knew then I would not be leaving any time soon. Reginald had no reason to let me return. Declared unwell, I was no longer an obstacle. He could sell Thornhaven piece by piece, while I sat behind locked doors, my voice stripped of meaning. The first weeks nearly destroyed me. I cried until there were no tears left, and I stared at the ceiling for hours, counting cracks, wondering if madness might truly come, if despair went on long enough. The other women frightened me at first. Some whispered to themselves, some screamed without warning, others rocked back and forth in silence. In time, I learned their stories. Many were like mine. Wives who had objected, daughters who had refused, women who wanted more than obedience. Mrs. Lavinia Thurston had been committed by her stepson when she refused to sign over her late husband's business. Miss Georgiana Fawcett had published scientific work under her own name. Lady Millicent Ashby had loved the wrong man. We were not mad. We were inconvenient. Life at Briar Cliff followed strict routines. We woke at 6, ate thin porridge at 7, spent our mornings sewing or gardening. That afternoons were reserved for meetings with doctors who asked questions designed to trap us into admitting illness. I learned quickly that the truth was dangerous, so I nodded. I agreed. I became quiet. I watched. I learned which nurses were kind and which enjoyed their authority. I paid attention to schedules and habits. Somewhere beneath the sedatives and despair, a small flame refused to die. It was during a garden walk in October that I saw Emmeline Fairfax. At first, I thought she was a vision. She had been my companion before my marriage, a steady and loyal friend. When she spoke my name, her voice broke, and I knew she was real. She had searched for me. Reginald had refused to see her. My solicitor would not speak. At last, she found me. She took my hands and swore she would not leave me there. Her visits became my lifeline. She brought books, paper, news of the outside world. On a gray December afternoon, she leaned close and spoke words that changed everything. She reminded me of my grandmother's trust, a fortune held in Switzerland, beyond English law. Reginald knew nothing of it. The funds were untouched. Hope stirred for the first time in months. We began to plan quietly. Through Emmeline, I was introduced to a solicitor named Benedict Harcourt. He explained the law, its cruelty, and its narrow cracks. The trust was my shield. The false commitment, my opening. I learned to appear obedient. The doctors relaxed their watch. And then, one spring morning, Emmeline arrived with news that shocked me. Reginald was dead. A carriage accident on the London road. I felt no grief, only silence, and beneath it, relief, but Thornhaven was to be sold. He auctioned to pay his debts. My home would be torn apart unless I escaped. And so the plan moved forward. One dark night, a kind nurse looked the other way. I walked out of Briarcliff in a borrowed cloak. The carriage waited beyond the gates. As the wheels turned and the asylum disappeared behind us, I wept with a joy so sharp it hurt. I was free, and London awaited. Freedom did not feel real at first. Even as the carriage carried Cordelia south through the night, every shadow outside the window felt like a threat. She half expected the wheels to stop, the door to be thrown open, and firm hands to drag her back to Briarcliff. But the road stretched on, mile after mile, and no one came. By morning they reached London. Emmeline had arranged discreet lodgings in Kensington, a modest brick house tucked behind iron gates and climbing ivy. Yet it was quiet and respectable, the sort of place no one looked at twice. When Cordelia stepped inside and the door closed behind her, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hand to her chest. For the first time in 2 years, no one held a key to her freedom but herself. The days that followed passed in careful preparation. Mr. Harcourt came often, bringing documents, advice, and calm reassurance. He explained what Reginald's death truly meant. Though she was a widow now, the stain of her confinement still clung to her name. Legally declared unwell for so long, she would need time and proof before society accepted her return. Until then, discretion was her shield. The newspapers spoke endlessly of Thornhaven. Reginald's debts had shocked even his friends, and creditors circled like birds of prey. Christie's announced the auction with great fanfare. The catalog listed every room, every heirloom, every piece of her childhood reduced to ink and numbers. Cordelia read the catalog late into the night, her fingers trembling as she turned each page. The music box from her nursery, her mother's writing desk, the portrait that once hung above the staircase. Each item felt like another farewell. But one entry held her breath completely. Lot 247. Thornhaven Manor and Estate. Estimated value £10 million. When Emmeline showed her the bank statement from Switzerland, Cordelia could barely believe her eyes. The trust had grown far beyond what her grandmother had left. Careful investments, decades of quiet growth. The money was hers. Truly hers. For the first time since her marriage, Cordelia understood the meaning of power. The question was how to use it. Mr. Harcourt proposed a bold plan. She would attend the auction herself, hidden behind a veil, presented as a wealthy foreign widow. The funds would pass through holding companies and trusted intermediaries. Her name would not appear. No one would suspect that the woman bidding was the same Duchess once declared mad. Cordelia agreed without hesitation. She was tired of hiding in corners. She wanted to stand in that hall and take back what had been stolen. The morning of the auction arrived cold and gray. Rain slicked the streets of London, and carriages lined the road outside Christie's. Emmeline helped Cordelia dress in black silk, elegant but restrained. The lace veil hid her face without obscuring her sight. When Cordelia looked in the mirror, she saw someone new. Not a victim, not a prisoner, a woman in control. Inside the auction hall, the air buzzed with quiet excitement. Collectors, nobles, and businessmen filled the seats. Cordelia took a place near the back, her hands folded in her lap. One by one, the possessions of her past went under the hammer. Each sale felt like a small wound, but she held herself still. Finally, the auctioneer announced the final lot. Thornhaven. The bidding opened at $5 million and climbed quickly. Cordelia waited. At $9 million, only 2 bidders remained. One was a loud railway baron. The other was a tall, dark-haired man, seated near the front. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at her memory. When the bidding reached $10 million, Cordelia raised her paddle. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward the veiled woman at the back. The auctioneer hesitated, then repeated the figure. One by one, the other bidders fell away. The hammer came down. Sold. The sound echoed through her bones. Cordelia did not remember standing or leaving. She only remembered the rain on her face outside and the way her knees nearly gave way. Thornhaven was hers again. The city buzzed with rumors. No one knew who the mysterious buyer was. Mr. Harcourt moved swiftly. Medical opinions were questioned. Documents were reviewed. Doctors who had once spoken with certainty suddenly found their memories unclear. Within weeks, Cordelia was declared of sound mind. Only then did she return north. The carriage rolled through the familiar countryside, green and alive beneath spring sunlight. When Thornhaven came into view, Cordelia's breath caught. The house stood empty, stripped bare, but it was standing, waiting. She walked through echoing rooms, touching walls, imagining life returning. She slept her first night wrapped in blankets in her old bedroom, and woke to birdsong and peace. Work began immediately. Servants were hired, gardens were tended, furniture slowly returned. Thornhaven breathed again. 3 weeks later, a card arrived for Sebastian Wyndham, Earl of Hartwell. But Cordelia remembered him faintly from her youth, a quiet neighbor. Serious, kind eyes. He had been one of the final bidders at the auction. Curiosity overcame caution. When he arrived, recognition passed between them instantly. He knew her. She saw it in his eyes. He came not to accuse, but to apologize. He told her of Reginald's visit 2 years earlier, the loan he had refused, the rumors he had heard, the guilt he carried. Cordelia listened in silence, something warm and unexpected stirring in her chest. All this time, someone had seen. Someone had cared. They spoke long that afternoon, of the past, of regret, of survival. When he left, Cordelia realized her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope. And as the sun set over Thornhaven that evening, she felt it clearly, that her story was not finished, not even close. Lord Sebastian Wyndham did not disappear from Cordelia's life after that first visit. He returned a week later under the simple excuse of discussing boundary matters between their estates. Then again, to recommend a gardener. Then again, simply to see how Thornhaven was coming back to life. Each visit felt natural, unforced, and slowly the empty rooms of the manor began to feel warmer whenever he was present. Cordelia noticed small things about him that others might overlook. The way he listened without interrupting, the care he showed servants and tenants, the quiet sadness that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. She learned of his late wife, Rosalind, who had died after a long illness, and of the years he had spent alone afterward, burying himself in duty. Just what surprised Cordelia most was how safe she felt with him. There was no sharp edge to his kindness, no sense of being watched or weighed. He never questioned her choices or doubted her judgment. He treated her as an equal, and after all she had endured, that respect felt like a gift beyond price. Summer passed into early autumn. Thornhaven changed with the season. New furniture arrived. Books filled the shelves again. Laughter returned to the halls. Cordelia began hosting small gatherings, careful at first, then with growing confidence. The whispers followed her, of course. Some spoke of her strange disappearance, others of her sudden fortune. A few dared to repeat the old rumors of madness. Sebastian silenced them without raising his voice. His presence alone was enough. One afternoon in October, but Cordelia stood in the rose garden where her grandmother had once walked. The air smelled of earth and fading blooms. Sebastian joined her, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, heavy with words waiting to be said. At last, Sebastian broke it. He admitted he had loved her long before the auction, long before he understood what she had endured. He spoke plainly, without drama or pressure. He told her he did not expect anything in return, only honesty. Cordelia felt fear rise in her chest, sharp and familiar. Love had once been a door that led her into darkness. She remembered Reginald's charm, the way kindness had turned into control, how trust had been used as a weapon. For a moment, the walls of Briarcliff seemed to close in around her again. But Sebastian was not Reginald. She looked at him. It truly looked, and saw no hunger for power in his eyes. Only hope and patience, and a quiet strength that did not demand. When she told him she loved him too, The relief on his face nearly brought her to tears. Their engagement was simple and swift. They saw no reason to delay joy. They agreed their marriage would be one of equals. Separate estates, shared decisions, full honesty. Mr. Harcourt ensured every legal protection was in place. Cordelia would never again belong to anyone but herself. They married the following spring in the small chapel on the Thornhaven grounds. Emmeline stood beside Cordelia, her smile brighter than the morning sun. The ceremony was private, attended only by those who had stood by her when she had nothing. As Cordelia walked down the aisle, she thought of the girl she had been when she first married. Hopeful, trusting, unaware. She was not that girl anymore. She was stronger now, wiser. And this time, love felt like a choice, not a trap. Sebastian's vows were steady and clear. When Cordelia spoke hers, her voice did not tremble. The kiss they shared was gentle and sure, and the applause that followed felt like a blessing rather than a performance. Married life was not perfect, but it was honest. There were nights when Sebastian woke from dreams of his first wife, and days when Cordelia startled at sudden sounds. They learned each other's shadows and met them with patience instead of fear. Together, they turned Thornhaven into a place of warmth and purpose. They improved conditions for tenants. They opened their doors to neighbors once wary. And with Emmeline and Mr. Harcourt's help, Cordelia began something she had promised herself long ago. She helped women, quietly at first, then boldly. Women wrongly confined, women silenced by husbands or fathers. Legal funds were created. Doctors were challenged. Laws were questioned. Change came slowly, but it came. Years passed. Thornhaven flourished. Hartwell Court and Thornhaven became linked not just by marriage, but by shared values. Emmeline found happiness of her own, marrying Mr. Harcourt in a ceremony filled with laughter and relief. But Cordelia and Sebastian grew older together. They never had children, but their lives were full of purpose, full of chosen family, full of peace. When Sebastian died after a sudden illness many years later, Cordelia mourned deeply, but she did not break. Grief no longer frightened her. She had learned that love did not disappear simply because someone was gone. In her later years, Cordelia often sat on the terrace at sunset, watching the light fade over the hills. Thornhaven stood behind her, alive with voices and memories. She thought of the woman who had once been carried from that house in silence and shame. She smiled. They had told the world she had lost her mind. But she had found herself, and in doing so, she had claimed a life no one could ever take from her again.